right-hand corner. You got it. All right, we are live. Excuse me. Joining me today is a guest of whom I'm metacognitively certain is very special, and I'm glad to have here, Megan Peters. So thank you for joining me today. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about who you are and what you do for those who might not know you.
Sure. And first I'll say thanks so much for having me. This is a really great pleasure and honor. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation we're going to have.
Well, I hate to disappoint you, but.
So my name is Megan Peters. I'm an assistant professor of cognitive sciences at UC Irvine, which is just south of Los Angeles. And before my faculty position here, I was an assistant professor of bioengineering at UC Riverside. And before that, I did my PhD and postdoc at UCLA. So I'm almost a Southern California native at this point. Didn't actually grow up here, but I've been around here for a long time.
Okay. As a native, I confer honorary native status to you hereby and forthwith with all the benefits that confers, which is none. No, that is awesome. So you're someone, there's a lot to talk to you about, but one of the things I wanted to kind of mention at the beginning is your career trajectory is kind of inspiring. Because, and I know I've heard you talk a couple of times about the kind of the dark moments of the soul when you were, looking for a job and the sort of thinking about the path you have chosen. So I wonder if now that you're here where you are, when you look back on that journey, do you think that you were deluded and you got lucky, or do you think you made the right choices, or how do you view that path?
I'm really glad you asked this, because I think that everyone's journey is really different, and I'm not saying that mine is brighter or better or worse or anything than anybody else's, but mine I think is pretty different from actually even just the typical journey. So I kind of I did all the things that you're not really supposed to do. So you're not supposed to do your postdoc at the same institution that you did your PhD at.
Yeah, they do say that.
You're supposed to go somewhere else and get out of your department and demonstrate that you can stand on your own 2 feet. But I did that. I stayed exactly where I did my PhD. I did switch labs and I switched PIs. So I went from doing multisensory integration with Ledan Shams to working with Hak-Wen Lau, whom I'm sure your listeners are very familiar with, working on—
Who's that guy?
Computational modeling and metacognition and neuroimaging.
Okay, so I didn't know that. So you were already there in a different lab.
Yeah, okay, I was. And I finished my PhD exactly when Hak-Wen moved to UCLA. So it was like, well, okay, I guess I don't need to go anywhere. This is great. So I made that mistake, which turned out to be fine. And then I also went on the job market much earlier than I felt ready. And I did that because I wanted to stay in Southern California if I could. But I also wanted to, if I couldn't, I wanted to move to a place where my partner would be able to get a job too. I didn't want to move to like Nebraska or, I don't know, Missouri or something. And he's
called the two-body problem in philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah. And he's an engineer. And so we would need to move to, a kind of reasonably large metropolis. Probably we couldn't move out into the middle of nowhere.
Right.
And so there were a few jobs that came up in the Southern California region and in Northern California, like in the Bay Area, that seemed like a really good fit for my skill set and my background. And it felt really too early. But I also felt this like immense pressure that if I didn't try now, the next year, maybe there wouldn't be anything available in a place that I wanted to be. And then at that point, if I didn't get anything there, then like, what are my options? And I really felt strongly that I wanted to stay in academia. I actually had an interview for an industry position, and they offered me a second interview and I turned it down.
Wow.
Because I was like, this is not for me. I want to stay in academia. So against the advice of my elders, I went on the job market a little early. and I applied to.
So wait, you mean against the advice of your advisors?
Yeah. It wasn't really against their advice. It was more that, especially Hawkwan said, like, you don't need to worry about this now. Like, you'll be fine. You really don't need to worry.
Yeah,
it's early, but if you want to do this, like, he was supportive, when I decided to do it. He was like, you're making a mountain out of a molehill here. It's going to be fine. But I felt this immense pressure in my then situation. So I applied to 6 places that first round, and I got exactly 1 interview and exactly 1 offer.
Wow.
And that's really atypical that you apply to that few and you get any interviews at all.
Right.
And I think it was just a right place, right time. I got really lucky. Riverside had created this interdisciplinary initiative where they were hiring someone who quite literally they wanted to have 1 foot in like neuroscience and psychology on the one hand and 1 foot in engineering. And I'm not a trained engineer, but I did computational modeling. And so I fit enough of the boxes.
Right.
That I guess I looked interdisciplinary enough, and they. And
besides, you could say, if I need to know anything about engineering, I have someone I could ask.
Yeah, exactly. I've got friends.
Yeah, exactly.
So that was really atypical. Like, I have friends, academic siblings almost, or people I kind of grew up with throughout conferences and throughout our PhDs across the world who had a really different experience, who applied to 50 or 75 or more places and got a handful of interviews and a handful of offers, and they had to move, and they're having to move to make it work. And so I felt extremely fortunate. And I still feel extremely fortunate. So Riverside was really good to me. And then Irvine approached me and said, we want you to apply to our current open position. And I said, okay, well, what's the harm? I'll try.
Yeah.
And then they gave me a job, and this is an even better fit.
That's so cool. But I mean, so I guess, that's awesome that you got that. So I guess part of the answer is that it's luck.
Yeah.
But you also made the choice. You followed your, what you wanted to be doing, as opposed to just like what was fashionable or whatever, like what people were suggesting you doing. But part of what I was wondering was like, was your work focused on consciousness at that time when you were looking for jobs? And was that how you were presenting yourself, as like a consciousness scientist or researcher or whatever? Or were you like, no, I do attention and perception, but sometimes talk about consciousness, or how? So I'm curious about how you like snuck past the gatekeepers as someone so interested in studying consciousness.
I think that's a really interesting question too. Because so until recently, I still felt this, like, I'm not allowed to say the C word kind of thing. Right. But I think I started being more comfortable saying that while I was at Riverside, actually, because in that first year, I got to go give, when you become a new assistant professor, and like you just kind of take that leap, all of the local departments are like, hey, come give a seminar at our local, colloquium series or something like that. So I got to actually go and give my job talk essentially after I'd gotten the job, but the same kind of set of slides, the same kind of story, because like, what was I going to talk about? And I got to go give that at a bunch of engineering departments, which I never would have done otherwise.
Oh,
and
cool.
I got to meet all these people who actually didn't quite think that consciousness was a crazy thing. And they were studying it in a very different way than I am. But they still were able to put the C word, in places in writing. And so when I went to back up though, when I applied to the Riverside job and I was applying to other places, I did mention consciousness, but I think I really focused on perceptual decision-making, phenomenology, and multisensory integration. It's also where I was published. Right. So my publications were psychophysics and computational modeling and that kind of thing for the most part. And so it made sense to focus on that. I didn't really focus on the phenomenology though. I really focused on the like metacognitive evaluation and computational modeling of that, especially for the engineering interviews, because it was, how do you sell philosophy to engineers. Well,
Yeah.
let's do that. Yeah.
It's hard. You
but
do
it- but
philosophy
it
of
was-
engineering. That's hard. No, I'm just kidding.
But it was a really fun challenge because it forced me to think in a completely different way about what I was studying.
Right.
And I'm really glad that I did that because I got to meet a whole lot of people, both in my department and the rest of the engineering school at Riverside and in the surrounding engineering schools and like across Southern California. I got to meet all these people who changed the way I think about consciousness science because I was living in engineering and I had never done that before. And that was really valuable. So I'm glad I did that.
It's so important, I think, for people to have that kind of cross-disciplinary acculturation, like to live in the other camp and see how things are talked about, the problems are approached in that discipline. Yeah. It's really eye-opening. I know I've had that experience a couple of times working in labs and stuff. Anyway, so yeah, that's really interesting. But so you I guess what I'm trying to get at is your sense of I mean, is what you're saying is very interesting. But when you were when you came in to be a postdoc in Haquan's lab, you knew you wanted to work on consciousness questions. And so you knew that already prior to that point, I'm assuming. Or did you sort of just figure that out then? Or like, how were you thinking about that as you went into the lab?
Well, I actually, I applied to work with Haquan as a PhD student and I did not get in.
Uh-oh.
So
I didn't know that.
Yeah. I think I was waitlisted and then I was
at Columbia, you mean?
Yeah, at Columbia. And so I had wanted to work on that for my PhD. And working with Ladon actually on multisensory integration at UCLA kind of scratched the same itch in a way that in retrospect turned out to be really, really good for what I wanted to be doing. So I learned all of this, like she does multisensory integration. How does the brain knit together qualitatively disparate information from your different sensory organs into a unitary experience? That's kind of the sales pitch on her website. And I read that and I was like, oh, this sounds like consciousness to me. This sounds like, how do we construct the unitary experience that we have of the world? And of course, as you get into it, you realize, oh, okay, I'm studying beeps and flashes. I'm not studying like consciousness. But I wanted to work with Haquan for my PhD, and but vying for the top spot, of course. And so I was also very, very, very happy to get to work with Ladon. I'd already been living here in LA, and so I got to meet her ahead of time, and that was very cool. And I'm really glad that I did that because that gave me such a fantastic toolkit to then come into Haquan's lab as a postdoc and be able to apply all of the computational modeling rigor that I had learned as a PhD student, but then like pointed at consciousness and pointed at metacognition. And so it turned out to be a really, really, really good thing.
So in a sense, it's almost better to have that kind of training doing something else and then use those tools to think about consciousness rather than jump right in. Or is it
and I don't know what it would have been like with Haquan, like as a PhD student. It was just a very different experience. And I was really excited to work with Ladon, and I'm really glad I did that too. So it was, I don't want to give the impression that it was like second choice or anything.
No, totally. No, I'm not getting
absolutely not. But it showed me, and I tell this to my students now too, that even if you're not doing like the thing that you think you actually want to be doing, the skills that you're gaining and the ability to think about science that you're gaining, you're going to come out what you really think you want to be doing, which may change. Didn't for me, but it may change for you. From an angle that therefore is truly unique, that nobody else is really coming at it with exactly that skill set. And that's really cool, because then you can ask and answer questions that no one's ever asked before.
That's well said. I agree completely. And that kind of brings us to you're already having an impact on the field of consciousness science, and you have a couple of big projects, a funding consciousness project, you have Neural Match Academy. So I know I want to get your actual work in a second. I know we haven't got to that yet. We're going to, but I want to make sure that, because I'm really interested, part of what I'm interested in is like learning about your work, obviously, but also like getting this little group that we have together, this like the idea of a science of consciousness taken seriously, having it established. And so I think the role you're playing is a positive one in accomplishing that goal. And so I applaud these projects. I think they're awesome. But anyway, so I'll shut up now. Can you say a little bit about them?
Well, first, that's really kind of you. Thank you for saying that. I hope that what we're working on is having a positive impact, both in the science, but also in kind of the meta science or the infrastructure. And I also want to say, before I get into this, that I'm really grateful for UCI in this entire enterprise, because UCI is one of those places where consciousness is not a dirty word. It's got this really fantastic history. I mean, Dan Dennett got his start here. So he's like, this is one of the places where you can openly talk about consciousness and people don't look at you sideways. And I feel really grateful for being.
I feel like I could make a Dennett joke here, but I won't.
So anyway, but I feel really grateful then that I'm applying for these grants, and these grants and these projects, some of which you just mentioned, they have consciousness in the name. And that's kind of like, like the name of the project is like, funding consciousness science, or an adversarial collaboration on consciousness, theories, or something like that. And
right.
And that's pretty cool that I can do that, and that those are going to go into my funding profile and my tenure application in a couple of years.
I couldn't. Yeah, that's awesome. The consciousness is there. It's part of why you're there now officially.
It is. It is. Yeah. So you mentioned that there are a couple projects that you wanted to talk about. So I guess I'll take this opportunity to say the first one, which is this project that was actually funded a year ago, but we put it on hold because of COVID, because it in-person workshop, that's the whole point. So this is a project that's funded by the Templeton World Charity Foundation, and that I'm leading with Brian Odegaard, who's at the University of Florida, who is my academic brother. We did our PhDs together, we did our postdocs together. And so now we get to lead this initiative together, which is really cool. And the idea is that I'm sure you or of course you, but like I'm sure a lot of your listeners also maybe know the paper that Matthias Michel and 1,000 other people published a couple of years ago, including us, on how consciousness science is hard to get funding for. And this is especially true in the United States, that there are these initiatives in the EU that are specifically targeted towards consciousness science. We don't really have as many of them, or any of them, here in the United States. And if you kind of take a step back and you're not really in it, and you look at the surface level, it kind of looks like the NIH and the NSF and maybe the Department of Defense and these other big federal funding sources and mechanisms. They seem like they're not aligned with consciousness science.
Right.
But they seem like they're not aligned with consciousness science. And I think that that's actually not true. I think that there are many, many points of overlap. I mean, you and I know that consciousness science pervades everything. Like it's important for medicine. It's important for artificial intelligence. It's important for basic mental health. It's important for just everyday living, attention, like linguistic, like basically everything. And from my humble perspective. And so, but I think the point is that like this apparent misalignment is illusory.
Right.
That we actually have a lot of points of overlap, and that the misalignment therefore is kind of linguistic in nature.
Sometimes I hear people say things like, well, we don't need like a consciousness science because we already have like a science of perception. We have a science of attention. And, so then there's just, no need to add this other discipline or something like that. Anyway, so I have my thoughts about that, but how would you respond to someone who said that, this endeavor to like single out, there's already plenty of funding, just like, work on perception and attention, and it's consciousness included in those, plenty of it.
I think that's part of it. That yes, of course, like perception and attention are intimately intertwined with consciousness science, but there's also a lot of oh gosh, there are so many things I want to say. What order should I say them in? I think there's a lot. Well, so a lot of studies of attention and perception and linguistic acquisition and all of those things, they miss all of the studies of the function of consciousness, like which we, is kind of a big deal, that we want to say, well, why do we know that we exist? Why do we have this phenomenal awareness? And one of the most prominent kind of categories of theories is that consciousness serves a function. It allows us to behave flexibly and adaptively under different environmental conditions. It allows us to reorient, to change our interpretation of exactly the same information based on contextual cues. It does all sorts of things that kind of first order, like stimulus response stuff can't do. And so if we ever want to build a Roomba that like makes, reasonable decisions, we might want to consider why consciousness evolved. And that like it, if it is purely an epiphenomenon, then, fine, but it seems likely that maybe it's not, that like there's a reason that we are aware. And so if we want to build truly intelligent artificial systems, or we want to understand disorders of consciousness, you can't do that by just studying perception or attention. You need to actually study consciousness. So I think, I don't remember what the second thing I was going to say.
Yeah, you had a lot actually. But that's good, because I already want to stop you and ask you about that first thing. So I guess because this is a nice, unless you had some, well, you didn't really mention Neuromatch Academy, I guess, but or get to talk about that. But did you want to mention that?
I can mention that too, because it's related, I think, to what we were just talking about. So Brian and I have this initiative where we're going to try to have a workshop, and we're going to have early career consciousness researchers in the United States and get them together with program officers and more senior researchers who've been kind of successful in acquiring funding from these big mechanisms, and just get them to talk to each other and find points of overlap.
Right.
And I think that part of that is going to be a recognition on everybody's part that consciousness is not only done by people who want to kind of talk about ESP and telepathy and the vibrations of the universe and kind of this like, magic crystal stuff, that this is a real science, and that it really does in a very targeted fashion, match the priorities of the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. And part of doing that is going to be to continue to train consciousness scientists, or to attract people from other fields into consciousness science who are using cutting edge tools and techniques, and who have training and background in things that are not necessarily specifically consciousness science. I came from multisensory integration. I knew I wanted to come back to consciousness, but that's where I came from. And I don't think I would be where I am now if I had taken a more direct route. And so Neuromatch Academy, I think, is one way that we can do that too. So this is an online summer school that I started with. It wasn't just me, so I don't want to say that. It was like 200 of us basically.
Yeah, it was a lot of people.
Yeah. But it grew out of the Cosmos Summer School, which was started by Gunnar Blom and Paul Schrader and Conrad Cording. And they invited me to co-organize that, and then COVID hit and the world exploded. And we said, oh, let's just put it online. How hard can that be? We started recruiting people to help us. And then it turned into this massive thing. So it's an online computational neuroscience summer school worldwide for free or very cheap. And last year we did computational neuroscience. This year we have the same course that we've kind of polished and revamped a little bit, and then we're adding a learning course too. Awesome. So if we can have people who go through these PhD in a box, and they really are, it's like 3 intense weeks of 10 hours a day, do computational neuroscience, and come out the other end basically like having been drinking from a fire hose for 3 weeks, but you at least know the toolkits that are out there, and you have like some experience with them. Now, if you want to do consciousness science, you could take all that stuff and point it at consciousness.
Yeah.
And I think that that's part of what we need to be doing.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that's really cool. I highly commend all these endeavors, and it's great to see people innovating and using these, obviously pandemic's not a good thing, but it's to make the most out of it and turn it into something that could be a positive is a great achievement, actually. So yeah, that's awesome. Okay. So I want to actually start to asking you about some of the things that you've said about consciousness. Some of them actually were coming up sort of in your comments, which I think were kind of holding some of these. So I want to ask about, I guess, since we brought it up at the beginning, you seem to be saying something about the conscious and the unconscious distinction, or not, you weren't saying something about it, but it was suggesting something to me about that. And of course, I know about your paper with Hak-Wan. And if I could summarize that paper, I guess what I would say is that it's not so much that you think that unconscious perception doesn't exist, and maybe even that you think it has been demonstrated to exist in some cases, like in blindsight, maybe, but that in the vast majority of cases, there's a methodological problem which prohibits us from drawing this conclusion. So I want to ask you about that argument. But first of all, this is something that's in textbooks as like a discovery. That this is something that's just reported, in your general psych textbooks, your intro to neuroscience textbooks. So I guess my wider question is, first, I want to ask you about the details of that argument and how you arrive at the experiment you did with Hak-Wan, all that stuff. But more generally, do you think that it's irresponsible of like the field to be saying, we've discovered that there are these processes that are unconscious, et cetera. So are we misleading the students by talking about this and not a subtle way in the intro books, do you think? So anyway, I know that's a lot, so I just threw at you, but can you say something about any of that?
Okay, yeah. Well, first, I don't think it's wrong at all to say there's stuff that happens in our brains that's unconscious. Like absolutely, there's stuff that happens. There's all sorts of things that happen that are unconscious.
But that's not perception being unconscious.
Right, exactly. That's kind of the crux of the argument in this paper, is that without getting into the semantics of it, that doesn't seem to count as perception that might drive goal-directed interaction with the environment and that kind of thing. So yeah, the idea is that we all think that, and we had that little survey that we put in like the appendix too, that, even people who study this for a living, like we do, kind of have this intuition that unconscious perception, not just unconscious processes, but truly unconscious perception exists. It's totally fine that like you can have subliminal perception,
right?
Like your brain perceives, but you don't. The point of the paper then was to say, well, no, on what basis do we all have this intuition? And the basis turns out to be kind of a folk psychology, like we all think that this exists. And then when you ask people to say, well, how has it been demonstrated in the literature? A whole lot more people say, well, actually, I don't know that it's been convincingly demonstrated in the literature. Yeah. And the reason is that the way that it has been demonstrated has been like, I'm going to show you a thing and like, you need to present it, or sorry, you need to perceive it and tell me what you see. And then I ask you if you saw it and you say no.
Right.
And that just, when Hak and I were first talking about this, that really just rubbed us the wrong way. And like, we were absolutely not the first people to point this out, by the way. This had been a problem that was pointed out 60 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. That's it.
Yeah.
So one of the issues here is,
but it persisted, and there's so many studies now done with, thousands and thousands of dollars per study of neuroimaging, where it's like you put someone in a scanner and you show them stuff and you ask them if they saw it or not, and then you like look at the differences in brain responses when they saw it or when they didn't see it.
Right.
And that just really feels like not tight science.
Right. I mean, and it's funny because like at the beginning of all this, not the beginning, but the beginning of the current surge of contemporary interest in this problem, you have people like Bernard Barr saying, well, this is how conscious science has to be done. The method of contrastive analysis. This is the only way to do it, is you find cases where they say they see it, and then you find cases where they don't, and you compare the cases. But what you're saying is that there's this problem, and the problem with the criterion, I don't know, I think people, by this point, people probably know what it is, but just in case they don't, the basic idea is that you might have the experience, but just have your criterion set so low that you don't say you have the experience.
So
You have that high, sorry, yeah, I know, I have dyslexia.
Yeah. That's basically the argument is just because you say you didn't see it doesn't mean that you had exactly zero phenomenal experience.
So just in your mind is just, this is a clarificatory question. I promise there's no traps involved or anything like that. But in your mind, when you say that, do you mean that the person has an experience that they can't access or that overflows or something like that? So that they actually have an experience, but they just don't know it. And so they say, I don't have it. Or do they have the experience, but they kind of can't tell, that's just, they're uncertain about it. That's the metacognitive uncertainty or something like that. And that's why they say they don't say it. So I'm just curious in your own mind, like how you picture this, the problem being instantiated.
I like both of those options. The third option, which is the boring one, which is the one that we have kind of put as the central argument in the paper, is just that if experience is on a continuum, you have to set a yes/no threshold somewhere. And maybe you just set it a little too high. And so it is not about, I'm uncertain about whether I had an experience. And it's not about, I had an experience that was phenomenal, but that overflowed access. It's a much more boring, straightforward argument that I had an experience, but it was kind of weak. And so like in the context of all the other stuff you're showing me in this experiment, you're flashing stuff on a computer screen, I'm going to say no, because it was comparatively weaker than all of the other stuff that you showed me.
I see.
But
So
I like both of your options too. But the thing is that we can't tell. We can't tell all three of those. And all three of them could be, in fact, all three of them now, as we've put them forth, are cases where phenomenal experience did occur and you still said no.
Right, exactly. But so I see, but you were thinking of something less, like you were saying, more boring. I guess I wouldn't call that boring, but so it's more like they have the experience, but they just kind of go, it's not relevant to like the question they're asking me, so I'm just going to say no.
Yeah, or it was like, let's say that on a scale of 0 to 100, I'm going to show you a whole bunch of like flashes and beeps and stuff in a computer experiment.
Right.
And most of them hung out in the, 50 to, or let's even make it harder, like in the 25 to 100 range. But then this particular trial, this particular flashy beepy thing that I just showed to you, seemed very weak.
Right.
And in the context of all the hundreds of other things that I've been shown in this experiment, like, no, I guess that doesn't count as me experiencing it. So I'm going to say no.
Right.
And this is like kind of the insidious one too. It's like not even an interesting reason why you would say no. It's just, that's why I call it boring. It's like, it just fell below a threshold. And it's not even like the person is lying. They're not lying to you. They're just, you made them set a threshold to say yes or no somewhere, or 1, 2, 3, 4, or whatever your response modality is. And they said no, but that doesn't mean there was zero phenomenal experience.
Yeah, it's funny because, I mean, this problem, there's got to be a way to get around this problem, which we'll talk about hopefully in a second. But it really, first you got to recognize that it's a problem. I mean, it's like AA. The first step is like acknowledging that you have this issue. And a lot of people, I don't think they really acknowledge that this is an issue, at least, in their work, because I think at least that people that work in consciousness, they still have this like verbal report is the gold standard and there's no issue with it. And that's the only thing we have to go on. And maybe there's some issues with it and, certain cases, but generally this is the only thing we have to go on. So some people might see this as a very pessimistic move that you're making here. Do you see it as undermining, as being that like pessimistic, or is this like just a little not a nitty gritty, but like, what do they call it? Like a, like a tiny detail that you got to fix, but nothing major.
I think it is quite pessimistic, and I think that's why when I remember when I first presented this work when I was a postdoc and I presented at ASSC, and I like vividly remember some of the people that I most respected in the field being like, "Well, you just didn't do it right. Like you didn't find unconscious perception because you didn't get the masking right." And like that very well may be true, and I'm very happy to be proven wrong that
Yeah, of course.
We've done a couple follow-ups, and so far they haven't really shown anything promising. Although Matthias Michel and Axel Clearmans have been working on some follow-ups using slightly different masking techniques that might look a little bit more promising. But that's not the point. The point is not like evidence of absence, or sorry, absence of evidence is evidence of absence. The point is not like I have just disproved 60 years of psychophysics. The point is maybe we should pay a little more attention to this, which is pessimistic, because even in that vein, it is what we're saying is any study that purports to find unconscious perception and therefore to match other aspects of computation or brain activity or whatever between conscious and unconscious. So you can do this contrastive method. So you can do the subtraction. Any other study that does that, but does so based on this yes/no response, is a little suspect.
Right.
And that's a very aggressive negative stance. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think like, again, I'm happy to be proven wrong here, but the problem is that we did like the kind of most basic obvious thing, which everybody does, like, oh, I'm going to mask the thing and then I'm going to make it unconscious. And therefore I'm going to compare conscious and unconscious trials. And the masking made it unconscious, but therefore you can still see it unconsciously.
Right.
And therefore I'm going to compare the brain activity or, reaction times or whatever. And I'm going to get like the measure of consciousness that I care about. And we did the most basic, obvious thing that everyone just kind of assumes, like we masked it and therefore it's unconscious. And certainly it was, but it killed the consciousness and it killed the perception at the same rate. And that's the problem.
Yeah. So can I ask you about the details? Because one thing that I'm confused about is the kind of definition that you guys that you and Hakwan offer of what it means to be unconscious in terms of D prime equaling 0. So I want, because I find myself somewhat confused by that idea. So can you tell us why did you arrive at that definition? I know you talk about it in the paper, but I mean.
Sure. Yeah. And you mean D prime of like the detection D prime kind of is 0, or the metacognitive. Yeah. So, okay. So the idea is you have, maybe we should do a little methods teaser so that people know what we're talking about. So the idea is you show someone a target and you mask it. And so you make it hard to see. So you do like flash, mask, and then like you show the target and then you do some other flashes of mask afterwards. And then you say like, what is the identity of this target? Is it tilted left or right? And then you show someone exactly the same sequence, but you make the target actually invisible. You just take it away. And then so there's a target present and there's a target absent. And you say then, which of these two decisions do you feel more confident in? And in a follow-up experiment we did, which of these two stimuli did you see better? And the results were the same. And the goal was to say, if we can create conditions where when the target is actually there, you can do the task. So you can tell whether it is tilted left or right above chance. But doing that task is subjectively, phenomenologically, introspectively, no different from doing the task based on nothing. So it's unconscious. Then you should have essentially D prime is 0 or 50-50 betting when we say, which one do you feel more confident in? So you have
your meta D prime.
It's not even meta D prime, it's just introspective access. Just like you're 50-50 betting on one choice or the other, because they are subjective metamers. Like they're subjectively indistinguishable from each other. Despite the fact that if pushed, you can do the task above chance.
Right.
So that's the goal, is that we basically, in demonstrating that effect, we would show that masking can turn off the subjective access without killing the objective access. And what we found is that there was no combination of stimuli options that produced that effect. That as soon as you could do the task, tell left or right, tilt, as soon as you could do that, you had some sort of subjective, they were no longer subjective metamers, the two intervals.
Yeah.
So does that help make sense of the logic?
Yeah, no, yeah, it does. But I guess, so I guess, is there an assumption? It's hard to put it, what's bothering me here into words, because I'm inept at this. My only job is to put these things in words. Okay, so is the assumption here that you would not, and this is related to your other work on metacognition, but do you, on your view, this is a separate question, but a sort of sidebar question to thing I want to ask about this. Do you think you could have unconscious metacognition? Not in the sense that the target's unconscious, but in the sense that there's nothing that it's like for you to be in the metacognitive state.
Well, so there's evidence from other paradigms that yes, or it seems like there's evidence from other paradigms that yes, you could have unconscious metacognition. And so this is actually, I think what you're getting at is the most common criticism that we receive of this paper, which is, couldn't you do this? Which one do you bet on? Or which one did you see better kind of task? Couldn't you do this and have no subjective experience that's driving it?
Right.
Couldn't you do that task unconsciously? And so to that, I mean, the answer.
And so the broader question is, isn't that a poor measure of when you're conscious of the thing or not? The better one might be that you say,
Right. Yeah. So I think that this is, that this is the most common criticism. And I think that, it's been 6 years since we published that study, which is nuts. And 7 years probably since I first presented it. And these are the same criticisms that came up there. So,
but this isn't one that's listed in the back under objections.
It kind of goes with the unconscious hunch objection.
Okay.
Same kind of thing, which is listed there. So I think the idea is outside the context of this metacognitive component. We do assume that D prime above 0 means that you are perceptually aware, you're capable of doing something. And D prime at 0 is used as a stringent criterion to demonstrate that the prime was truly unconscious, say, in a priming experiment. So that convention is beyond the scope of just this paper, that D prime or betting above 0 means consciousness, and betting or detection D prime essentially at 0 means unconscious. So applying those same conventions to our paper, you come to the conclusion that we did, that if detection D prime, so to speak, or the metacognitive kind of betting capacity is above chance, then that indicates some sort of awareness.
But so do you not, sorry to interrupt you, but do you think, I'm going to do it anyway, I'm sorry about it. But is the same objection that you were just making applicable to blindsight too? Because I know like GY has some confidence in his judgments, but that's because he's done it so many times. You might think it's because he's done it so many times. He knows he's reliable. So he's like, I didn't see nothing, but if I said I saw it and it's tilted left, then I don't know. You tell me I get all these right. So over time, wouldn't you then become sort of confident, but not because you're having any sort of experience, but simply because you have other reasons to think you're reliable or something?
I would love to do this particular paradigm or something like it, or have someone do it, not just me, but like have somebody do it with a blindsight patient. Like, I think that would be really potentially.
And then compare what you guys found to the blindsight data.
And then and look at, because there have been also cases where the Azzopardi and Cowie kind of like square root 2 relationship between detection D prime and 2 AFC discrimination D prime, 2 AFC detection versus yes, no detection D prime. That root 2 relationship breaks down in blindsight, but it doesn't in like, normal individuals or neurotypical individuals. So I think doing something like this in a blindsight patient might be really informative. So someone please go do that.
Yeah, exactly.
Someone please go do that.
Okay.
But I think I don't have any experience with blindsight patients personally. So my only knowledge of the experience that they are having, or lack of experience that they are having, comes from reading. That's it. Or watching, videos of their interviews. But I tend to align with Ian Phillips' conclusions on this a little bit, which is that blindsight seems more like qualitatively different vision than like truly lack of any sort of I don't necessarily agree with how Ian got to that conclusion.
Right.
And I would have to go back and reread some of his papers to have that conversation in more depth. So, but it does seem to me like it's possible that the experience of a blindsight patient is not that they are completely unaware of the thing that's out there. It's that the experience of that thing is so different, so qualitatively different from what they expect from vision, that they don't count it as vision, or that their brain doesn't count it as vision. But that doesn't necessarily mean that like there is truly a complete lack of any sort of phenomenological difference between a thing being there and it not being there. And that's the same kind of argument that we're trying to put forth in this paper, which is, if you have a gut feeling or hunch that's driving your betting behavior, like I bet on that interval and not this interval, then that's still something that is like, it's not visual.
Why would it have to be something that it's like? Why think there's anything phenomenal there? I mean, why can't they? I don't know
if we can tell the difference between those with this paradigm. This paradigm certainly isn't perfect.
I mean, because that's what I was thinking though, is that one thing you might have, what's going on here is that there's a point at which subjects can do the task. And then you're saying, and they also have some confidence in their ability to do the task, and you're saying, and that indicates to us that they're conscious, because this is widely thought of as an objective measure of when someone's conscious of something or when there's a conscious state around. But when there's a conflict between that and what the person says, I guess one of the sort of the question that I'm asking, the meta methodological question is like, when you have that conflict, which way should you go? So you're arguing you should kind of go with the objective measure, that we should take that over the verbal report. And what I'm suggesting is that I'm not sure that's the right response, because you could still make sense of how that objective measure is incorrect, namely in the way that we were talking about before, that you have this kind of unconscious, no phenomenology at all, gut feeling, confidence assessment, whatever. But that's completely dark, and everything's completely dark. And then, but later on, at some point, for whatever reason, there's conscious experience. And so, and the thing that you guys the argument you present in that paper doesn't really address that claim. I think that's what you were just saying. And so in my mind, the argument doesn't really, you have to buy this assumption about the metacognitive stuff and that there's not unconscious metacognition before the argument goes through. And I haven't really seen. That's what I meant when I said I was confused about the definition, because it really packs a lot in there, so that, I can see how if you start from there, then you get to this conclusion, but there's a question about which way you go once you have all the pieces on the table.
I think that's a fair point. I think that the question about whether you can have unconscious metacognition is a big one. And I think it's worth exploring. I think that in most of our psychophysics literature and our perceptual literature, that the presence of confidence judgment that is not like zero, or the presence of, say, meta D prime above zero is a sufficient indicator for awareness. It's not like that they are the same thing. Confidence and awareness are not the same thing, but that in these kinds of behavioral paradigms, that the presence of a confidence judgment that's above complete zero is a sufficient indicator for awareness. But I think that, well, and there are a few papers that suggest that you can have metacognitive capacity without having any sort of at least conscious access to the stimulus about which the decision and then the metacognitive judgment was made. So there's this this blind insight paper that's about artificial grammar learning from like 2014. I think the first author is Scott or something like that. And they claim that people can learn these artificial grammars and that they can show metacognitive capacity even when their D prime is actually zero. And so even when they can't tell like whether there's a grammatical sentence or not, or when they have like no ability to say like kind of consciously or to report that this is grammatical or it's not. And I think, as far as I know, that is one of the only studies that has shown this kind of truly unconscious metacognitive capacity, because that kind of has the same problem as demonstrating unconscious perception.
Yeah,
totally. How do you show that it's truly unconscious? And then you fall back on the same, like, oh, its D prime is zero, so therefore it's unconscious. And so we have this problem that's bigger than, I think, this one study. I think that it's worth exploring because it also has a lot of other implications for when we are using confidence judgments or metacognitive anything, computations to study not just metacognition, but consciousness in non-human animals. Then we have to say like, oh, well, does the presence of the rat's capacity to actually make reasonable metacognitive judgments indicate that the rat has some sort of phenomenology because he indicated confidence, and confidence depends on consciousness. So I think it's a bigger question than this paper, and I don't have a good answer yet, but it does have these really interesting implications, like, are rats conscious? Are monkeys conscious?
Yeah, exactly. I notice over here too that Matthias is saying in the chat that there seems to be a metacognitive deficit in GY when they're matched between blind and normal visual fields.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Kind of a non sequitur here, but someone's mentioning, do you know Jeff Kirchmar? I don't.
Yeah, Jeff Kirchmar here.
Someone's a big fan of his Roadmap to a Conscious Machine. Are you familiar with that work?
I saw that just recently, but I haven't read it.
Okay. So sorry about that.
So sorry, Jeff.
Grant has asked that before.
Is like 2 down from mine. And so
okay.
when we go back to the real world, I'll have to ask him about that too. But
I mean, you're open to the possibility of machine consciousness, sort of as a, right? I've heard you talk about that, I think.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I don't know that we're there yet. No, of course not. I don't see why it is impossible by any stretch of the imagination. I think it's totally possible. I don't think we're there yet, and whether we actually ever will get there is a different question, but I don't see why it could not happen.
Yeah, I would like for it to not happen, but who knows? So the problem of the criterion then, as we've been talking about it, is I mean, I still don't know what to make of like the GY thing. I'm still thinking about this. So maybe I'll just kind of table that. But I'm curious about what you think, if any, route forward there is, or how, like, if this is such a fundamental thing, it has such wide ranging consequences. You said at the beginning it's a pessimistic finding, right? So what do we do about it in your view? Like what's the right response?
Okay. So you mean taking a step back from, like, is metacognition sufficient indication of awareness?
Yeah, exactly. Just if the argument goes through and your pessimism is justified, then what do we do?
I think the first thing to do would be to and I want to preface this by saying that I don't think this paradigm is perfect at all. I think it's just slightly better in some ways than what else we've got. But I think that we should use this as a tool, because this is actually a really, setting aside the confidence consciousness isomorphism for a moment, this is a really conservative paradigm. And so it allows us to then go and look for conditions that might actually produce something that looks like blindsight, even in normal observers. If we find a particular masking technique or a particular stimulus type or something that produces what we call that blindsight curve, like this ability, performance capacity above chance, but betting behavior at chance.
Right.
If we can find something that does that, then that should be the favorite tool, the favorite paradigm that everybody uses. That should be the thing that we scan. We should stop using these paradigms that are not actually producing the effects that we think that they are.
But what if it's only in blindsight that you find that? I mean, because that seems to be like the implication is that.
Right. Well, then I think we have two paths potentially forward. One is if we want to study unconscious perception and we show that we cannot reliably produce it in normal observers, then that line of inquiry is dead. We can't do that. Or what we can do is we can go the kind of relative blindsight route, which is I'm going to produce conditions where you report or exhibit more or less metacognitive capacity, more or less confidence, more or less reported awareness, where I don't actually like fully turn it off,
right?
But I push around on it in a way that bifurcates it from your performance capacity. Right. So that at the very least, I'm not confounding what I'm doing with performance capacity. And then I think we can go and start to study the computations and the neural correlates that produce awareness without having to turn it off. It would be nice to maximize the contrastive effect, the contrastive approach. But if we can't maximize it, well, at least we can push around on them independently. And I think that's
the problem. Sorry, but I agree with you. That's so you don't need the full turn off, the full disabling of the conscious experience or whatever to get some interesting results. The problem with the way we're doing that now is we have to mess with the stimulus in order to get the performance to be matched, in which case there's always a question about. So it's like the best case scenario would be if you could do that somehow without messing with the stimulus, but that seems like impossible given the tools we have right now, or that are widely available.
You have to mess with the stimulus, or like you have to zap the brain, or you have to like do something. And I don't know what the best answer is there. I think the answer is we have shown, and by we, I mean the field, not we, like, me. People have shown a handful of ways to push around on awareness or confidence kind of independently of other stuff. We've just got a hell of a lot more work to do to find cases where we mess with the stimulus minimally, and maybe we just haven't hit on exactly the right manipulation yet, or maybe the answer is you have to mess with the stimulus, but if you mess with the stimulus in these 7 ways, all in the same individual, then each one has its own problem, but in aggregate, they all the problems cancel each other out. And so then
that would be nice.
Well, I think that it's possible that we could say, I'm going to mess with awareness in this way, and I'm going to mess with it in this way, and I'm going to mess with it in this way. And that I can demonstrate that all 3 of those things have very measurable, quantifiable effects on confidence that are different from each other. And then I can do the reverse correlation, tie that to the stimulus manipulations. I think we just have a lot of psychophysics to do, and a lot of people are into like really precise, careful psychophysics.
It's painstaking work. I mean, just to be honest, like people who work in psychophysics, it's a lot of work. There's no doubt about it.
It is.
But so it sounds like that. I personally think this is one of the problems with the science of consciousness is that there's so many loose connections between data and theory that you can interpret it in any, and of course you can, there's always underdetermination of theory by evidence. That's, philosophy, old school problem, whatever. But this is especially bad. Like you can always like mess with stuff and reinterpret it. And so it's hard to see like how theories of consciousness get falsified, because they're especially prone to just, changing, modifying, and accommodating the evidence. So that might be one of the reasons why people think the field is not as rigorous, that, we can't really even, in your experience, is there any other area of psychology or neuroscience in the last 100 years or so where this is like, was the same thing true about attention? Was the same thing true about motor control, or like any of the other things that, or do you not know? I mean, if you don't know, that's fine. I'm just curious in your experience.
I don't think I have an answer to that question. I would say that motor control probably did not so much have this issue, but and it feels a little bit like the war between behaviorism and the cognitive revolution in a way, where like the reason that behaviorism existed is because they said, well, we can't look inside your head. We can't look inside your mind. And so we're just not going to like bother with that. That won't create falsifiable theories. It won't create falsifiable models. And so therefore we're just going to do behavior. And that's kind of it. But aside from that, I don't know. I don't think I want to venture into what other kind of sub-regions of psychology may have experienced the same problem. But I think you're absolutely right that one of the problems that we have, that if it's not unique to consciousness, it is certainly particularly bad in consciousness research, is that we lack quantitative theories. And to make a theory falsifiable, you really want it to be quantitative, because otherwise the only way you have to falsify it is by a qualitative effect. And often those are very hard to find, a qualitative divergence between predictions and accuracy, and or predictions and empirical results. And also a lot of the theories make the same predictions qualitatively.
Exactly.
More awareness means more performance capacity, means higher confidence, means, I don't know. And so like if they all make non-unique predictions and they're all qualitative predictions, then of course we're not going to be able to falsify anything. That's bad.
And that's one of the reasons, this is again sort of parentheses, but one of the reasons why IIT's got so much attention, I think, is simply because it has some math attached to it and people are hungering for something quantitative. But let's not talk about that, because you have a much nicer quantitative suggestion for us to delve into, which is, I think, one of the important contributions of your recent work. I think this is on a review or whatever, so let's not spoil it, but anyway, so the idea that metacognition can be a useful tool, and part of its benefits is that it's formalizable in this way.
Sure, yeah, we can talk about that. That's great. Yeah, we'll leave IIT on the wayside here.
Yeah, sure, why not? It gets enough attention. Like it's a quantitative theory, but I think you're right, and that has benefits, but there are other quantitative theories which could be developed.
Yeah, I will avoid going on that rant. So yeah, thank you for bringing this up. You're right, it is under review, but there's a preprint out. So if people want to read it in its current form, at least before I get the reviews back, which, we'll pan it, I'm sure, but we'll see.
Nah, I doubt that. I'll put a link up to it so people can find it.
Okay, so the idea is it's not even trying to make the link between metacognition and consciousness from a theoretical perspective. Because a lot of people, including you, have done that in a much more elegant way. The point that I'm trying to make is really just that that metacognition gives us a really powerful tool for studying phenomenology for three reasons. One is that there is something that is like to feel sure. So we've got at least some sort of like phenomenal character going on there, aside from this unconscious metacognition. So that's one of the potential objections. But assuming that kind of our intuitions and most of the psychophysical literature is true, that for perceptual metacognition, there's something that's like to feel like you can see well versus not, versus feeling unsure. Two, we have we have computational models that we can write down for metacognition. And we're borrowing a lot of these computational models from the perceptual decision-making literature, and we're pointing them at metacognition. And that's awesome because we can use signal detection theory, Bayesian ideal observers, drift diffusion models, like all of this computational rigor that's been developed over the past 50, 60, 70 years.
Right.
Or longer, like now we can point it all at metacognition.
Like we don't have to reinvent the wheel, it's there.
Right. We've got a lot, and like textbooks, this is textbook level stuff that we can use. But the critical one is the third property, which is that unlike kind of first order perceptual decision making, where there's a thing out there in the world and then you make a decision about it, so there's like one function linking thing in the world to internal experience and decision. Metacognition is a second step. It's hierarchical. It's second order, higher order.
Is this, so in your model, this is F dot, is that the F dot thingy?
So
the first order stuff?
Yeah, F is the function linking like stimulus or thing out in the world to what I'm calling X in the paper. So this is the standard notation of like, I have a thing that's out there in the world, a source S, and then I have X, which is an estimate of that source. And so there's a function, a generative function that you're trying to kind of reverse engineer, that your brain is trying to reverse engineer to make an inference about like the most likely state of the world. But metacognition has a whole second layer on top of it, right? So just like the first order judgment is about the external world, I'm preaching to the choir here, but the second order judgment is about the first order judgment. But this is
choirs like song preachings too, you know.
But yeah, but this is really powerful computationally, because it means essentially that there's a lot more ways that your metacognitive model, once you've written down all your equations, there's a lot more ways it can go wrong, where you can get the first order linkage right. And then your function linking first to second order could be wrong. And so then you can't fit the metacognitive judgments that a person produces or that a rat produces. But it also is much harder because just because your second order confidence judgments that your model predicts don't match the empirical data, if that happens, you don't know where the problem lies in your entire chain. You don't know whether it's the second function that you got wrong, or maybe it's the first function that you got wrong that feeds into the second function, and it's just not wrong enough that you don't like that the first order judgments still seem to sort of match. And there's just like so many moving parts here that it's if you get a model that actually does work, that does predict the behavior in both the first and the second order judgments that your agent is producing, that you're trying to fit, then you really have a stronger probability that you've discovered something true and real about how this particular phenomenological experience of confidence is constructed.
Right. So you have so many constraints on how to build a model that even finding a model is some evidence for it in a sense.
And that I think the key here is that you want your model not to just produce kind of reasonable behavior under reasonable conditions, but you need your model to break in the same way people break. Or in the same
That's an important point.
Yeah. So it needs to basically produce illusions, but at the metacognitive level. It needs to produce errors at the metacognitive level, but in the specific way that humans produce errors or that rats produce errors.
I mean, that was one of your points, is that people don't test that part of the theory a lot of times. They test that, does it match the data? Sure, but that's the successes, but also does it like fail in the same way is also an important test.
Yeah, like if I give you a really weird, if I show you as the human in my psychophysics experiment, a really weird situation, you produce really bizarro behaviors, I need my model to do that same thing.
Right.
And then if the model breaks in the same way that the human breaks, then we have a chance that we've hit upon something kind of real. And this was inspired by my work as a PhD student, where I studied multisensory integration, but specifically in the context of illusions.
Right.
The output of the system does not match the true state of the world. And so this is the same kind of thing. We need to be able to produce metacognitive illusions, so to speak. So if we do that, then we've created a chain of equations that are quantitative that ends in the production of at least one specific type of phenomenological experience.
And in this case, what you're talking about is the phenomenological experience of the confidence, the certainty. Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and you're very clear that you don't think this solves the hard problem.
No.
Like they're not saying, aha, this is, take that.
No, absolutely not.
So the project is M step. So it's a metacognition and a step towards the solution to the problem. So if I have a lot of questions I want to ask you, but let's suppose that they were all answered and I loved what you said. I do like what you say, by the way, but let's suppose that I fully bought it. Then how did I step towards solution? How does that provide a step towards, even if not the whole solution to the hard problem?
I think that the answer here is in part that we should recognize and kind of celebrate the precision that this would give us in exploring the nature of that one particular phenomenological experience. So now we, instead of saying, oh, I vary this thing about the stimulus and then it pushes around on the confidence in that way. Mm-hmm. That is like, I've got an input and then a giant black box and then an output. And now we can actually open the black box and we can say, okay, is it the input that changed? Or did what are the inputs that causally influence the experience of confidence? What are the changes to decision policies that causally influence the report of confidence or the experience of confidence? What are the extraneous factors that don't have to do with the stimulus that also potentially influence? So it just gives us a language, it gives us a framework.
But one can't help but notice the potentially Freudian slip, which just occurred, wherein one said one was studying the report, the experience.
Yeah.
So I'm not accusing you of anything here, obviously, but part of the reason why I wonder why it's a step towards a solution to the hard problem is doesn't it sound like it's a step towards a solution to the easy problems, which are problems about, how we produce reports and how information is processed. But what I guess I don't understand is how this would be a step towards understanding in general how experiences arise from physical substrates or why there's anything at all that it's like to have this confidence judgment. So that's what I guess I don't see how this is a step towards solving that, unless what you're saying is, the more we understand about how these things are implemented, then maybe eventually the less mysterious this will be. Or so I was curious in your own mind just how you thought it was going to inch us towards a solution to that problem as opposed to the other sets of problems which are allegedly easy, which are hard enough already, but still.
I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head that I specifically put, and I thank you for pushing on this. I specifically put in the paper the rest of the hard problem, which is this big unknown arrow. But I think that's exactly right. That this is a micro step towards probably closer to not even solving the easy problem, but pushing past a univariate one-dimensional solution to the easy problem, maybe. That it's been suggested by so many brilliant people how we can explore the dimensions, the dimensionality, etc. of phenomenological experience. So Rosenthal's quality spaces and so on. It's been suggested so many different times. I think that's exactly spot on, and that this is trying to get at a way to actually build what those are, so that we can quantitatively explore what those are and what goes into the construction of that quality space.
So this would be a higher order quality space, or you're saying that we could somehow find out about the first order quality space?
I don't know yet. I truly don't know, because
I see what you're saying though, because what you're saying is, suppose you have these two functions f and g, then they have the things they pick out, x and y, whatever, And so if those domains are identical, then you would expect one thing. If they're separate, if they're different, you would expect a different thing. So that's the sort of thing you're saying, is that this will sharpen those questions. And that's the point you're making in the paper actually is.
Okay. And I think sharpen is exactly the right language. So thank you for saying that this is really just a tool, I think. I don't know what we're going to find. I don't know whether we'll just find that there is no such thing as a higher order construction of phenomenology or anything like that, that like maybe metacognition has nothing to do with the construction of phenomenology whatsoever. And
bummer.
But that like the space is X, so the first order space, and Y, the second order space, that there is an isomorphism or homology between the two.
Right.
That's possible, but we don't, this is, I hope, a more precise language for trying to ask those questions.
Right.
That we currently have.
And that's great too, by the way. So I want to ask about the confidence judgments themselves on the way that you're thinking about these things. If I can, I'm keeping an eye on the time. I got the things are happening around here. Sorry. But I want to ask about the confidence judgments themselves. Oh, hello. We have a sneaker, a hider in the house. You want to come and say hi? Say hi. It's Caden.
Hi, Caden.
Just up from his nap. He'll hang out for a little bit over there, I think.
Okay.
So the confidence judgments themselves, the way you've been characterizing them is as metacognitive, because they're judgments about the accuracy of the first order judgments. But I guess what's always been unclear to me, and this is just a general question since you're an expert in this field, but it's always been unclear to me is, so what is the content of these judgments? Is it like that state is accurate, or is it like what that state represents is accurate? Because one of them seems like it's a judgment about the world, and the other one is a judgment about a state. And it seems like the way you talk about these things, you go back and forth a little bit. It's like, okay, so it's like I'm confident that I'm seeing the object. It sounds like it's about my state, but I'm also confident the object's out there. That sounds like it's about out there. So how exactly do you think of the content, if we can use that other C word, of these metacognitive judgments, or do you not worry about that too much? Because it's a more philosophical question.
I know I do worry about it, but I think that's one of the things that I don't yet have an answer to, but that I want to have an answer to, is we kind of just assume, just like, you know, the easy version of writing down an equation that is how your confidence works is like, oh, it's the posterior probability of the choice that you made, done. Like, oh, at the end of the world, like, or at the end of the story, like I figured it out. And we're starting to realize that no, maybe that's not the case. And right. I think that your question is spot on, in the same way, in the same vein, which is, we don't know necessarily whether the confidence judgment reflects a sense of precision about your first order judgment, a sense of alignment between your first order judgment and the state of the world.
Right.
What are the pieces that additionally go into the confidence judgment that might not have anything to do with that system at all, that might be like your kind of state of being right now. We know also that there are other contributions to confidence judgments that definitely have nothing to do with your state of being, your first order judgment, maybe precision, or the relationship between your first order judgment and the state of the world. Steve Fleming's got that great paper on TMS where they zap motor cortex or premotor cortex, I can't remember which one, and they mess up your motor representations, and that screws up your confidence.
Yeah, exactly.
And so like there are all of these questions that we have that we actually, if you really take a step back and think about it, we don't necessarily know what exactly is going into that confidence judgment to begin with.
Right.
And we don't know under what conditions that confidence judgment reflects different readouts of what I am calling that Y space, which we kind of assume in the literature so far is that it's like a one-dimensional thing. It's like confidence going from less to more.
Right, exactly.
But I bet you it's got a lot more dimensions than that. And that when you report 3 out of 4 for your confidence, you are engaging in a really complicated decision policy and readout strategy of what is this dynamic, high dimensional representation or surface in an even higher dimensional space. I don't know what that looks like. And I think that
but so yeah, all that stuff's hard, but I guess I think I'm not sure if, so I think you're answering a question that's related to the one I was asking, but let me rephrase my question, which is,
okay.
Do you think is it possible? I'm gonna make myself look even more idiotic than I normally do by asking such inane questions.
I highly doubt
yeah, right. But is it possible that we could in the future ever discover that what we call confidence judgments are not metacognitive? That they aren't judgments about first order states at all, but they're judgments about the content of those states, about what they represent, about things in the world, in other words.
Okay. And now I think I understand that the confidence. Yeah.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
That the confidence judgment, instead of reflecting something about, the first order state, it actually reflects something about what that first order state is representing about the world.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think you were talking about like what feeds into the function that transforms the content of the first order into the higher, the whatever. But I was talking about what if the G state is not a higher or metacognitive state at all? Because it sounds like there's
like a pass through almost.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just about the outside world.
And it can still be a confidence judgment. But so I'm just curious, like, what are the reasons for thinking that it's like metacognitive or like higher order in our philosophical language? But
I think the evidence for the interpretation that confidence judgments are metacognitive would have to be the empirical evidence that, there are cases where you can push around on some of these stimulus properties, external properties of the world, and not push around on confidence, or vice versa. You don't touch the stimulus properties and you do end up like changing the confidence judgment. So I think that would have to be that would probably have to be my answer, that there is at least some component that is metacognitive about the confidence judgments. It may not be wholly, like entirely metacognitive in that sense. So this is
because like that one of your options was that it could be a judgment about the relation between the state and the external world, in which case it's partially metacognitive, but partially not.
Or that there's kind of a direct path from the world into the metacognitive judgment, which is that the inputs to that function are maybe the same things that are out there in the world, and not like whatever you did with them to get to your first order judgment. I think that all of these are possible. And as far as I know, I don't know of a research program or set of studies, or even a kind of beyond the very precise language in the philosophical literature. I don't know of a way to actually build experiments that would tease apart these options.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
That's what I'm trying to do. That's all I'm trying to do. It's like basically build a language so that we can exactly ask the questions that you are asking, which is, let's come up with what we think ought to be causally related to the confidence judgment, and why and how and in what way quantitatively. And then let's go build that experiment and compare it to our model.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a cool project. I like it. Now I want to ask about the implementation of it in the neurology, because you say some interesting things about that as well. So one of your ideas there that you're pursuing is that these kind of confidence judgments may be produced in the same area that the first order states are produced. And we may, in fact, involve neurons in the same area, but that are differently wired up, so that neurons may not really care about being inhibited by their neighbors. seem like they maybe care more about the world, and the inhibited ones care about the meta. Am I getting this backwards again, or which way here? So yeah, can you tell us about how you think this gets implemented in the brain?
Yeah. So this is the recent PLOS-Comp bio paper that just came out with Brian Falco. Yeah. So the idea there is that the same circuits are involved potentially in decisions and confidence judgments, which is consistent with what we know from the neuroscience literature, that you have evidence accumulation that occurs in like parietal regions, and you build up evidence towards a decision, and then you make a decision. But that the readout mechanism.
But just for clarity, the decision there is like, that's a dog or car there,
or the dots are going left versus right.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But about the world though.
About the world, yes, about the world. And then you have the readout mechanism essentially of these decisions that says, okay, once I've hit a threshold, like now what? That readout mechanism, which might drive like an eye movement towards one target or another, or like a button press. That the readout of the decision and the readout of the confidence judgment might depend on slightly like differentially weighted usage of the information, which would correspond in the neurocircuitry to different strengths of connections between this kind of evidence accumulation area and a later stage readout or a later stage processing area, so that the decisions kind of rely on, if I'm forcing you to make a decision between A or B, what should matter is the amount of A evidence relative to the amount of B evidence.
Right.
And that you should pick the one that has more, regardless of how much evidence there is for A or B overall. You might have a little bit of evidence for both or a lot of evidence for both. But what should matter if I force you to choose between them is which one has more.
Right.
But then the confidence judgment based on empirical literature seems to rely kind of more on how much evidence there was, never mind what the balance of evidence was. So once I've decided that it's A, because there was a little bit more A evidence than B evidence, then when I judge confidence, it seems like in cases where there was a lot of A evidence, I'm more confident. And when there was less A evidence, I'm less confident.
Right.
And
that's
so
one of the ways of manipulating confidence is by
yes, it is.
positive
Yeah,
evidence,
that's where this came from. Yeah. So the idea there is that, all of these types of processing or evidence accumulation are present in decision-making areas, but then like the highway splits almost. And the evidence or cars that were related to the decision go one place, and the cars that were related to the confidence go a different place, or something like that.
They're called vehicles. No,
but yeah, that's the idea, is that we should be able to see these slightly differences in, if you think about it as a neural network, the differences in weighting on the edges between the nodes.
Mm-hmm. And where would you expect to, so I got the impression that you could find these in areas that we wouldn't traditionally expect them. Because when when you think of perceptual metacognition, you think of like prefrontal cortex or something like that. But it sounds like you could find this sort of architecture like in parietal cortex, and even in visual cortex, maybe an MT or something like that. You could have this. So is that the way you were thinking of it? Or do you think this is specifically something that's in the realm of like DLPFC, or do you have a view about that?
Yeah, I think actually though that you're right, that this differences in covariation with confidence as a function of these different types of properties of neurons could be visible potentially in parietal cortex in these evidence accumulation areas. And the specific hypothesis is about evidence accumulation, like adding up evidence over time. And so we need to go looking in areas that have these like kind of self-recurrent excitation evidence accumulation properties. So that would be LIP over like MT or something.
Okay, I see.
And we found some preliminary evidence actually down in the superior colliculus, which has some of these evidence accumulation neurons too. Very preliminary evidence. But yeah, the idea is that, just because the think about it this way, like, or at least this is how I'm thinking about it. I don't know if I'm right, but that the kind of decision about which evidence goes where, which information, let's call it that, goes where, that could be visible all the way down at LIP if you know where to look, if you know how to tag neurons with different properties. You could say, I think the information from neurons that have this property is going to be more strongly connected to confidence judgment, say. If I know how to tag those neurons and I know how to find them, I should be able to see that all the way down at LIP. Then I could say, okay, well, that information is likely being sent to areas that make decisions, or areas that make confidence judgments, that do something further with that information, that process it maybe in conjunction with other inputs that are coming in. Right. And that area then would be DLPFC or something like that, that it would kind of listen to these earlier areas, but not just listen to the lump of neurons in LIP. It listens more to some neurons than others.
Right.
And so therefore, then you can see all of the readout of confidence judgments and covariation with confidence and awareness and so on that we have seen in DLPFC and related frontal regions. So it's consistent
and
with.
So, but on your way of thinking, then if you block the DLPFC readout and just had the, like in the LIP, would you have the phenomenology? Would you have experience, or do you think that it depends on, or do you have that's something empirical that you think you wouldn't hypothesize on yet, or
block the phenomenology of the confidence, you mean?
No, yeah. So if you didn't have the DLPFC readout, if you blocked it somehow and you just had the activity or whatever representing the confidence judgment,
I think that it depends on where you think in this causal chain the construction of phenomenology, the generation of phenomenology occurs. I think.
Yeah, that's what I'm asking you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that the argument about these kinds of differential weighting of evidence driving confidence or decisions and so on, that's completely agnostic to the phenomenology. Mm-hmm. That I don't think that paper even mentions consciousness. And
yeah, no, I know, but I guess what I'm asking, what making me think of it and why I'm asking it is because you say there's a phenomenology, I can't talk anymore. A phenomenology, I never could actually, a phenomenology of confidence judgments, something that it's like to feel certain. So now we're looking at the neural implementation. We're saying, well, we can see these sorts of differentiation of neurons, even like in LIP, where there's some that seem to be doing confidence-like things and others that aren't. So is that where you, on your view, would expect the phenomenology of the confidence to occur, or does it have to go to the readout? That's what I was wondering about.
So my personal belief is that it has to go to the readout. It has to be further processed. So this is just like, you don't become, aware of the color green just because it hits your retinas. It needs further processing.
Yeah.
And so I would say that, yeah, the information needs to go to DLPFC. I am a higher order theorist. I believe that metacognition and higher order representations are related to phenomenology, and that, and I tried hard to stay away from that. But I do believe that, that it.
Yeah, but I wasn't trying to get you to say something about that, May. I'm not trying to trap you. But my question was, assuming that is the stuff in LIP metacognition.
No,
but it sounds like what you're saying is no, it's not.
No, I think it's the input to metacognition.
Yeah. But even though you can see like that those neurons seem like what they're doing is something important to metacognition, it's merely an input to it. So why do we think that, as opposed to thinking that's where that is metacognition? Like maybe even, metacognition that could be like unconscious or something.
So the question is, why do we think that the inputs alone are not phenomenologically experienced?
Well, no, but why not think they're metacognition? That whatever's happening like in LIP. So, because I thought the story, I'm probably confused because I'm, bad at this stuff, but I thought that what you were saying was you have these this area, there's these two separate sets of neurons. They seem to care about different things. One of them seems like that you're saying is the input to this system that does the metacognition system. So what's the input? I thought that the input was something about whether the state was, or the thing was reliable or not, or blah, blah, blah. So
yeah, so I think
so
this
that
is
sounds like metacognitive.
I think this is one of the inputs. I don't think it's necessarily the only one, because
But
we
no,
also
I agree about that, but it sounds like a metacognitive input though. So it sounds like metacognition.
yeah, I think it is a metacognitive input, but I don't think it's the metacognitive computation.
Uh-huh.
I think you have to do something with that information.
No, I know. But what I mean is that the input itself sounds like it's metacognitive.
The input itself is not metacognitive, because the input is about how much information is available or is accumulated for the choice that you made. So it's kind of tagged with the choice that you made, but it's still about the external world.
It sounds like it's about your choice though.
It's the evidence for the choice, but it's the evidence for the stimulus about which you made a choice. It's not about the choice.
Not the evidence for the stimulus about which you made the choice. Okay, so yeah, I guess I see why we think that. So the other neurons then are just representing the stimulus. These neurons are representing the evidence for the stimulus.
They're both representing the evidence, or it's like the relative evidence for each stimulus identity, or the kind of absolute or independent evidence for each stimulus identity. But the representations in LIP, I think I understand now the question. Sorry. Yeah.
No, I'm sure I'm just confused.
The thing that is being represented by all of these neurons in LIP, say, that have these differential inhibition properties, that thing that's being represented is still the thing outside in the world. It's not. Okay. So the decision variable is, and maybe this is not quite true for the relative evidence case, because like their relative activity kind of is the relative evidence for the two things. But again, it's about the thing that's out there in the world. It's not about the decision that you've just made. So the way that we could also think about this is another type of metacognitive judgment about this system would be, I'm going to look at the history of the dynamical like activity of these two neurons, or these two.
Yeah, okay, I see.
And that would be about the decision process, not about the external world.
Right, I got it. Okay, so I was misunderstanding what you were saying in the paper that I read. Okay, so what you're talking about is ways of distinguishing the kinds of evidence. I thought you were talking about ways of distinguishing which neurons were doing metacognition and which neurons weren't doing metacognition.
It's which neurons feed into metacognition.
Yeah, no, now I get it. Yeah. Now I get it. Yeah, I was confused. Aha, thank you for that. No, I should have paid more attention to that. Okay, so that's good. And that sort of answers my other question. And you already brought up the last thing I was going to bring up, which was the higher order theory stuff. So it is, I think, an open question, just so we'll end on this, because I do have to sort of wrap this up because the kids are up and I'm ignoring them. I guess I shouldn't do that. No, my wife's here. I'm just kidding. He's not roaming the house on his own. But so, you know, there's this linkage of metacognition with higher order theories. But not everyone agrees with that. And some people think that, you know, higher order theory should be linked more with like self-consciousness as opposed to metacognition. So in your mind, what are the strongest reasons do you have for linking it with metacognition? I mean, I think I know what some of your reasons are, but I'm curious, like, what do you think the strongest reasons for linking it to metacognition are?
Okay, so I think maybe I'll open by saying that my academic lineage plays a large role in my thinking process, and so I spent a number of years with Hawkwan and his ideas about perceptual reality monitoring, and it being this kind of metacognitive process that leads to the construction or the production of phenomenology. That's been really influential in my thinking. This idea that your brain has to decide what is real and what's not. And it can't do that if it only has a representation of something that's out there in the world, because there's no way to tell whether that representation is true or real if that representation is all that you have.
Right.
And so if you need to be able to tell the reliability or the probability of truth or something about that representation, you need something that kind of looks inward. You need a mechanism that is metacognitive. And it makes sense that the output of that would be related to your phenomenological experience, because that mechanism is going to tell you, am I imagining or am I seeing? And those are qualitatively different. That mechanism is going to tell you if I am seeing, am I seeing well or not? Those are phenomenologically different. And so it seems that it's metacognition is at least in the chain of command. It may not be the end of the line, but I think that there has to be some element of the phenomenal character of our experiences that is the result of metacognitive processes, and that it makes sense then for kind of evolutionary reasons that this metacognitive process and its construction of at least part of phenomenology, it makes sense from that perspective.
Yeah. So why couldn't you do that all from a first order point of view? I mean, obviously, where my allegiances lie. I'm not a super hardcore higher order theorist, by the way. I'm friendly to it, but I'm waiting for the empirical work to come in before I'm going to marry it or anything happens, other than me saying, okay, yeah, you're not contradictory or something like that. But anyway, so why couldn't what we were just talking about earlier, you cleared up a confusion that I had. I'm glad you did that, because I was confused, but why couldn't the sort of stuff we were just talking about do what you said they couldn't do? So you got to differentiate reality from imagination. So you have some first order processes that compare evidence, blah, blah, blah. First order processes output, it's real, no higher order or anything.
But like, where do they output to?
To systems controlling behavior. I mean, that's sort of what the global workspace theory says, right? It's like, this is broadcasting to a lot of systems that do a bunch of stuff. And then you can reason with it. You can say things, you can point, you can press buttons, you can answer psychologist questions.
Yeah. So I guess my answer to that is that some of the aspects of our experience do seem to be about that first order representation, about its, not just its content, but it's like from a statistical perspective, it's like, first moment, its second moment, its third moment, like those seem like the variance of that thing over time seems to matter. Do you have especially for this sense of confidence or reliability?
Right.
And
so it sounds like that's a phenomenological consideration, that there's like part of the way it's like for us is higher order or metacognitive.
Yeah. And so I think we have these metacognitive components. Something assesses the reliability of our first order representations. That there is a system that listens to that kind of is about the internal representation, which is the definition of metacognition. Right. Whether that's conscious metacognition is, I think, a completely different question, but we definitely have like the ability to assess our own reliability. Right. And that produces an aspect of our phenomenological experience. And so it has to be at least an input to that.
Yeah, no, I myself am moved by the kind of phenomenological considerations. But it sounded like you were making, because I know Hawkwan makes this argument, obviously I know, but that's kind of like almost got an a priori flavor to it. It's not about phenomenology. It's just about like, look, there's got to be something in the brain that's monitoring the first order signals and determining whether it's reliable or not. Maybe he's moved away a little bit to sort of like computer science GAN stuff, but I think that the kind of early idea, at least he had, was that there's no way to make sense of what the brain does without there being something like this involved. But I sort of feel like, yeah, can't the first order people say, yeah, sure, there can. Like, that's sort of what global workspace. I mean, maybe and this is sort of work with, that's come out recently with Nick Shea and Chris Firth, right? They have that paper about the global workspace needs confidence judgments, but their kind of confidence judgments are all first order confidence judgments about the stimulus. They're not higher order metacognitive. I mean, they're not like in the metacognitive in the way that we would think about them, I don't think. But anyway, so I'm not 100% convinced by that kind of like, there's got to be something that monitors what the brain is doing in order to distinguish reality from imagination. Anyway.
Well, I think that, I mean, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think that Hakwan's argument is that one way for the brain to solve this problem and to develop the mechanism that can do reality monitoring would be with a GAN, with a adversarial network. That is it's an engineering solution to the problem, and so therefore, which explains a lot of why we have mental imagery and why we have.
Yeah, but it's not clear that GANs are metacognitive either, and for the reasons we were talking about earlier.
No, it's not clear. Yeah, and maybe I believe that metacognition is involved in the construction of phenomenology, but I also agree with you that we need a lot more empirical evidence to arbitrate these possibilities.
Yeah. No, and I'm not, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say these are like well thought out objections or anything. I just think that there are things that need to be thought about and nailed down, which is, I mean, it's better than what was going on before, because like 10 years ago, no one cared about higher order theories at all, and they were ignored, and every theory was a first order theory, and people thought that's all there was. And there was this weird thing called higher order theories that some strange people thought. Now we realize these are a lot of different kinds of higher order theories. Some of them are strange, some of them are even stranger. I mean, it's all incredible variety. So I think that's progress. However, the idea that I was thinking was that Hakwan's argument that this is an argument for the higher order theory is that, well, just given the way the brain works, there's got to be something like that happening. Even if you bought that, it's not clear that it would be, like you just said, linked to consciousness, because I think that it's not clear to me why you couldn't have these things happening unconsciously. Like for me, I'm aphantasic, which I didn't know about till I started studying philosophy. And then people started talking about, inner senses and picturing spotted hens. And I was like, well, that's all metaphor, right? No one's actually picturing a picture in their head of a spotted hen or anything when they do that. And they're like, yeah, we are. And we're counting the spots. And I was like, what the, whoa. So it blew my mind to find out that they were, I thought it was all like metaphorically speaking, as they picture it, or, it's in my head. I thought that was all loose talk, but some people really mean it apparently. So that's interesting. So I have that condition. I've never been tested for it, but I can verify, like from my lifelong experience, that when I say imagine an apple, I just kind of think apple. That's that. However, nonetheless, in subsequent research on people with this ability, let's call it, since I don't think of it as a condition, there's no real deficits that they have. Like they can do mental rotation, they can even do metacognition, it seems like. So I don't know, isn't this evidence that a lot of the stuff we're talking about can occur unconsciously? Or, I mean, I know all the stuff we talked about at the beginning, let's table that for a second, but I mean, isn't this at least suggestive of the possibility?
First of all, that's really interesting. I didn't know that you that's, yeah. So
I'm an interesting
I have so many questions, but we don't have time. So,
sorry.
Yeah. So, well, let me ask you this very, very basic question then, about your own experience with aphantasia. Is it a complete lack of the ability to internally produce any sort of phenomenology, or is it just visual?
I think I can hear like my own voice in my head, so to speak, like when I sub-vocalize or sub-vocal. Mm-hmm. And I used to think maybe I could hear like music, like guitar riffs or trumpets or something, but now I'm not sure. Hakwan says I'm probably just imagining my voice making the sound like or something like that. And I'm like, can I tell if it's really a trumpet? I spent too much time trying to figure out, am I really hearing a trumpet or my own voice make the sound of a trumpet when I'm imagining this thing from Miles Davis being played or whatever? So I don't think it's a complete lack of imagery. And I could dream. I think I'm pretty confident that my dreams are like, have experience. I'm not a dream skeptic or anything like that. But I know like Bryce Huebner, a friend of mine, philosopher, aphantasia too, he dreams no visual experience in his dreams, he says. So, I mean, I think there's spectrums of stuff here. But so, yeah, I don't think it's complete lack of imagery, but certainly visual imagery, zero, like just zip, nada.
Interesting.
Sometimes I feel like I can almost picture things, like I'll get like a brief flash, like, oh, could it, but then not really. But still, the point though is like, yeah, but you can still rotate things mentally. You can still, so maybe, I mean, I would guess, my guess is that aphantasics can tell the difference between like reality and imagination equally as well as non-aphantasics. And so therefore maybe some of these things can happen in ways that aren't consciousness producing.
Okay, well, I have a number of thoughts, and I'm going to try to organize them.
I always like wait till last 30 seconds and then bring all the unanswerable questions. No, just kidding.
Well, I mean, it seems like then to use the GAN metaphor, then like the generative part of the generative adversarial network is like not working so well, which suggests that maybe,
or it is, but it's producing unconscious things.
Okay. That's also possibly true, that like there is an additional mechanism that kind of that's the discriminator. So like the discriminator is also probably working pretty well, but not like producing phenomenology, and like the output of the discriminator is not like going into something else. Yeah, I mean that's possible, and that I suppose is consistent with this idea that the discriminator in the GAN or the metacognitive component about any sort of regular perceptual decision making, that these are components of the phenomenological generation process, but they're not sufficient to explain how it all works, or they're just not sufficient for making it work.
Right.
I wonder what would happen if you put yourself in an MRI machine, like in Yuki Kamitani's imagery studies, and they say, okay, now think of baseball or think of dolphins or something, and like they can decode either your dream imagery or your mental imagery from your early visual cortex. What would be the difference then? Can they, if they could, then that suggests that the generator part is working, and then even the discriminator part might be working, but it might be this other kind of next level that takes the output of those things. And then, I don't know. I don't have
exactly
a smart way of answering this question. Yeah,
sorry, I didn't mean to spring it, but I just this whole idea of reality monitoring, it just strikes me as something that can be done unconsciously, and so I'm not clear what the connection to consciousness is with respect to reality monitoring. Generally speaking, I mean, that's a question for Håkon, obviously more than you, but I mean, insofar as you support that idea, I was curious what you thought about that.
Well, I'd like to work towards, for reality monitoring and for all of the other higher order theories, and I think that this is what we need to work towards, is just like nailing down testable, falsifiable predictions.
Absolutely, yeah.
And we don't, like, even for the ones that are championed by empirical scientists, we don't have that quite yet for a lot of them. Or we have it in a super narrow band.
And even worse, it's like, this is something I think where you had Leah Murdoch's talk recently at the was she at the Consciousness Club? I forget where it was, but she was basically saying all these theories are collecting data which seems to confirm their theory.
Yeah.
But they're not comparing it to each other and saying, hey guys, over here. But every theory says, hey, look, we're so well confirmed, like all this stuff confirms what we're saying. But that's happening everywhere, like in 4 different camps at least. So,
and she's part of that adversarial collaboration, and we're doing the kind of the same thing, which is the same impetus, which is, let's all stop working in parallel and start actually like trying to falsify each other instead of just finding confirmatory evidence for our pet theory.
Exactly.
It's absolutely right. That's what we need to be doing.
And sort of at the end here, sort of full circle, bringing us back to, funding and Templeton and all that. I wonder, I know I personally, just so you know, I struggled a lot before I personally took money from Templeton. And when I first started working with Hawkwan, I was like, we wrote our paper together, and he would, at the end of it, wrote funded by Templeton. I was like, take that off. And he was like, I can't. And I was like, then don't put my name on it. And he was like, well, let's put it this way. Hawkwan Lao is funded by Templeton. I was like, okay, I'll live with that. But don't put Richard Brown is funded by Templeton. I was like, that's not going to fly. And part of it because I didn't want to legitimize what I saw, what I saw as their program of trying to legitimize non-scientific questions by associating them with serious scientists answering serious questions. So it wasn't like I ever had a problem with the scientists using the money or what their science was. I was just like, you're legitimizing this agency whose goal is to promote like pseudo scientific beliefs. Eventually, obviously, I changed my mind. I'm neck deep up in 5 Templeton projects here, and part of it was by thinking through these examples with Hawkwan and arguing with him, like, we fought over this a lot, and he changed my mind, obviously. But I'm curious, like, what your view? Did you ever have any issues with this, or did you not care about it? I'm just curious. Part of the fund consciousness bit might make it more normal that regular places you could get money. Right now, this is like one of the few places you could get money to do this. So that's part of the argument there, I think. But anyway, so I'm curious, did you ever confront this dark issue, or were you you slept easy at night the whole time?
I think I see that there are a lot of kind of bigger questions that the Templeton Foundation is funding that maybe will border on the fringe for sure. I don't. I also think that what we're doing with the funding though is really good science, and
Right.
It's really hard to get funding for this. And so, to the extent that we can do good things with the money, I think that it's.
Is there, do you think, a danger? I know I don't want to put you on the spot. You're already looking like, don't make me answer these questions, and so that's fine. But at the risk of making you answer these questions, is there a risk, do you think, of publishing these things and then other scientists looking at, funded by Templeton, and thinking, I have NIH grants, they have Templeton grants, this is not serious?
I think that if you, and sure, you can judge people by where they get their money. Absolutely. Like if I take money from some, terrorist organization, then you should absolutely judge me.
Yes.
But the gatekeeping about, I have NIH money or I have NSF money or something. And so therefore the people who only have Templeton Foundation money or who only have private foundation money, let's just put private foundation money.
Right, exactly. That's the real point.
I think that gatekeeping is really ugly. I think that, and it perpetuates these problems. It perpetuates the like, consciousness science is not real science, like divide. Right. And I know scientists who are funded by Templeton and who are also funded by the NIH. And it shows that it's not, or funded by other private foundations and also funded by the NIH. Like I'm funded by CFAR and by Templeton and also by the Air Force. And so I think that like, and we just also, I'm co-investigator on an NIH grant that just went through. So I think that this is not.
And the Air Force stuff is scary. I mean, isn't that the fear stuff? And that's what they're going to do with that stuff.
That's all Hawkwan stuff. The Air Force stuff is the plus comp bio paper that you just.
That's stuff. Okay,
we're going to try to do decoded neurofeedback with that and push around.
No, that's going to be awesome, actually.
Yeah. So it's going to be really fun. But I think that these are, I think nobody should gatekeep where you get your funding from. I think that judging people on where they're like within reason, of course.
Right.
But I don't know. I feel like that's not a productive way to move our science forward, is to kind of look at the labels. It's like, look at me. I don't have a knockoff handbag. I have the real, like, like, okay, good for you. But like, it still holds my stuff. So like, I don't really need it to have the pretty label on it. And the more that we can knock down those barriers, especially because that gatekeeping is very real. I got
Right.
rejected for an NSF, sorry, an NIH grant as a primary investigator with another early career scientist. And one of the comments was, the two PIs have never had a big NIH grant. Do they know how to manage the money? So they refused to give us an NIH grant because we had never had an NIH grant.
Right. So they were saying you need a handholder, basically.
Yeah.
Someone, yeah.
Yeah. And then they wanted like a senior scientist. So we got a
Right,
senior scientist.
exactly.
And then they were like, what are you actually doing? You have the senior scientist on board. Like, you know, do you really need that person? Like, blah, blah, blah. So like, basically, I think that there are just so many political spider webs involved in,
Right.
in like whether you get NIH funding or not, that like anybody who's judging you on that is yeah, I'm not.
It happens. I mean, I agree with you about the assessment, but it's definitely a real phenomenon. It does happen. It should change. Sadly, as a philosopher, you know, we don't have to worry about that. No one pays us. No one care about money. We live in a bubble and just think all day, apparently. So, you know, it's a very different culture on the other side. And that's one of the things I think, you know, as a philosopher, I've sort of been on both sides of the camp. You know, I worked in some labs. I have a degree in psychology or whatever, but it's a very different mindset when you're wondering like where your money's coming from and, you know, who's funding me, than when you're just like, hey, I can talk about all kinds of weird stuff if I want to, and no one cares. They may say philosophers are weird, but and I think this is something that Haquan's been sensitive to for a long time, is that we need to be careful out here because, you know, they're judging us, and if we want money to do what we're doing, then we can't come off as a bunch of unserious, silly people. And so, you know, maybe you can overreact with that attitude, but it's something you should think about. Something that we do need to be aware of, I think.
Well, hopefully we can make the science speak for itself, right? That,
Yeah.
I mean, you can take foundation money and you can do crystallology, or you can take foundation money and you can do really hardcore computational cognitive neuroscience and really beautiful, careful psychophysics and computational modeling. And I think that is what we should be focusing on, is like,
absolutely let the work lead the way, because if it's well done and well thought out, people will critique it or follow it, and that creates a paradigm, a research enterprise. So I couldn't agree more. So I'm glad that we brought that up, because yeah, I've heard whisperings. Oh, it's like Templeton. It's like, okay, whatever. You know, I could see why people whisper and what the whisperings are about, but at the same time, I agree with the ultimately point you were just making. But I see now we're running short on time here, so I can't keep you forever. You have a real life, I assume. I wonder if I could just ask at the end if there's anything you were expecting that would come up that hasn't come up, and feel free to say no, but I always like to check at the end.
No, I don't think so. I think this has been really fun. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you too. I appreciate all your hard work. Your labor is valued. I mean, you put a tremendous amount of effort into this stuff. It doesn't go unnoticed. So I want to appreciate you for that. And thank you for that. And all of your interesting stuff. I'll put links to it so that people can check it out. In the meantime, hang out, and I'll say bye off the air. But otherwise, thank you very much.
Okay,
Megan.
thanks.
All right, so, yeah, ending stream. Okay. All right, we're clear.